Hey everybody, it's your Peacekeeper coming at you with a video on, well, let's just call it my opinion on whether or not the game is balanced. This is going to be a video series in which we talk about all of the different classes of ships, whether that's battleships, cruisers, both light and heavy, destroyers, and aircraft carriers. And we're going to talk about, on a tier-by-tier basis, whether or not I really think that the game is balanced at all. Now, what prompted this was a comment made by Sub-Octavian in reference to the citadel height of the Iowa and Montana. His comment was basically that because the stats did not support it, they didn't feel like buffing either the Iowa or Montana was necessary. Me being the type of person who really enjoys looking at that kind of information, decided, maybe we should go and look. So what I've done, if you look down in the description of this video, I've posted a link to a Google Docs file that has all of the battleships, which is what we're covering in this episode. I have all the stats for the battleships starting from the 21st of October and going back 2 weeks. And that is all 4 servers plus the averages across all 4 servers. Where am I getting that information from? I'm getting that information from Warships.today. Warships.today is just one of the many web pages that has all of these stats. It happens to be the one that I think a lot of people use. I know I use it myself for comparing my stats and just looking at my stats. Not that I really care about stats. I play the game for the fun of it. If I do well, I do well. If I don't, I don't. But the stats are certainly there, and it all comes from Wargaming directly through their, I think it's called the API system. Before we start talking about specific stats, let's talk about how we got these stats to begin with. Because the default Warships.today setup is to show the all-time stats, and it doesn't really lay it out in anything very clear and concise. So once you go to Warships.today, you click on ships and it brings you to this web page. You go to the when and you can select 2 weeks and you can sort it by whatever rate you want. We come down here and we choose our tier. Since the battleships start at 3, we want to start at 3. You can change the type to battleships and then we leave the nation blank. This will show all of the tier 3 ships. Now, we're going to talk about just the tech tree ships. This is ships that you can research. We're not going to talk about balancing premiums because premium ships are, depending on who you ask anyway, supposed to be at least marginally better than their tech tree counterparts, specifically because, well, you're paying real money for them. So we're going to leave them out of the discussion for that. For as far as I'm concerned, the Koenig Albert is just out of this discussion. So this is only going to be the 3 major tech tree ships. So that's how we got that information. One thing that I do want to point out, though, about this information is that it doesn't tell the complete picture. And what I'm getting at there is that while you may see a ship that has a stat that says, or a secondary stat at least, that says it shoots down more aircraft, that may not necessarily mean that it's actually shooting down more aircraft or has the capability of shooting down more aircraft, just that it could possibly be targeted by carriers more and thus is exposed to more aircraft, whereas other ships might not be because they've developed a reputation for just being aircraft eaters. It could be any number of different things. So these stats, really, we can take them at their face value, but when it comes down to actually parsing the finer details, it requires a little bit more nuance and justification and experience to back that up. And you guys can make your own opinion based on the stats. That's why I've made the stats available to you guys. So let's go ahead and let's switch to this document because I think that this document is pretty enlightening. Now, like I said, this is from the 21st back to the 7th. That's a 2-week period, so they're a couple days old, but the stats really haven't changed a whole lot. You can see that there are stats. Let me zoom in just a little bit here so you guys can actually read these if you don't want to pay attention to the document yourself, but the stats show all 4 servers and then an average across all 4 servers, and they're split by tier, they're split by the nation. The US is on the very first one, the Japanese Navy is in the second one, and then the German Navy is in the third one. Below each one is a rankings setup. Now, you'll see it says on average. When it says rankings on average, I'm using the averages across all 4 servers, which is that average of all part at the bottom of each ship, to make these rankings. And the rankings are just going to be based on if you're the number 1, if you had the most battles in that tier, you're on average, you're in the first place, second battle, etc. So that's pretty self-explanatory. So there's 3 what I'm going to call primary stats. Win rate, average damage, and average XP. Win rate can be influenced, if taken in isolation, can be influenced by factors such as division play, whether or not you're playing with division mates, team composition, etc. The hope is that the sheer number of battles, which for many of these ships is a very large number, that it averages out all of those problems and that they're not hugely impacting on the win rates. And we're also comparing across 4 servers, so we're getting the total number of battles there to compare those win rates to. So it's, in my opinion, we've got enough statistical raw numbers of data there to average out or hopefully eliminate that from win rate. But just be cognizant of the fact that ships that have a lot of division play can possibly have higher win rates. Average damage, average damage is a little bit harder to influence because that requires a skill-based function. Sure, if you have a battleship that's tanking for cruisers in a division, yeah, that can change that. Average XP is a good one to throw into the primary stats because it takes ships that may not have higher damage output and puts them in context of their capabilities as a team playing element. The big one for that is going to be people are going to look at the U.S. destroyers. In terms of damage output, the U.S. destroyers tend to be lower, but their average XP seems to be just a little bit higher than their other contemporaries. Now, we're going to talk about that when we get to destroyers. I believe that's going to be the next video. Don't quote me on that. It takes a while to put these spreadsheets together, but anyway, that's what that average XP is good for. The secondary stats that I'm looking at, kill to death ratio, average ship kills, average plane kills, survivability, main battery hit rate. In theory, and at least in my opinion, in a perfectly balanced world, the win rate, average damage, and average XP across all 3 ships should be relatively equal. And by relatively equal, I mean we're talking within a couple percentage points of each other. And the goal with that is simply put to make it so that even though ships may get their damage or their utility, their XP in different ways, it should all be balanced across the board. Just because a Japanese destroyer uses torpedoes doesn't mean it deserves to do 4 times the damage of a US destroyer. Just because a US destroyer is the king of contesting caps doesn't mean that it should have higher average XP over a Japanese destroyer, which is primarily a damage-dealing destroyer. The same thing holds true with battleships. And I realize that's going to ruffle some people's feathers, but in a perfectly balanced world, in a game-balanced world, all of these factors should be relatively even across the board because we're accounting for the fact that, yes, a Japanese destroyer is really bad at doing damage, or really bad at contesting caps, but is great at doing damage, whereas the U.S. destroyer is the exact opposite. Those ships shouldn't have progression changes just because of the different play styles. So we're trying to average out the play styles. The secondary skills are far less important in terms of whether or not they need to be equal across the board. If a ship has better survivability and its damage is the same, that just means that the ship plays differently. Obviously, that ship, especially in battleships, probably is a Japanese battleship that plays at long range that doesn't see direct combat very often. Or, for instance, aircraft carriers, another perfect example of a ship that has high survivability but has good damage numbers across the board. Main battery hit is another one that like average plane kills, can also be kind of skewed in context because, for instance, if you take the main battery hit ratios of a German battleship and compare it to the main battery hit ratios of a Japanese battleship, of course, a German battleship is going to have higher main battery hit rates because it's fighting at closer ranges than the Japanese battleship is. So anyway, as you can see, the secondary skills, which is that kill to death, average ship kills, average plane kills, survivability, and main battery hit, aren't nearly as important so long as the primary stats, win rate, average damage, and average XP, are relatively equal. Let's talk about Tier 3. Now, I'm not going to go through and read all these stats to you. I'm just going to talk about the rankings on average of where these ships sit. And the reason for that is simple. One, y'all can read the file. It's, like I said, the link is posted in the description to see the actual raw stats. Two, I've set it up so that the rankings show me exactly what the split is between the various ships. So we don't need to necessarily talk directly about each ship individually on each server. One other thing to keep in mind is that one of the comments that's frequently made is that, okay, Wargaming is using the Russian server for balance purposes. Is there an element of truth to that? I don't know. It certainly appears that way at Tier 10 for the Tier 10 battleships, but I also want to point out that the Russian server is the anomaly in stats, not the norm. If we go through and look at some of the stats for this, their stats and average damage values for battleships is almost always different. It's pretty rare to have one where they're pretty consistent, whereas the other three servers are consistent almost across the board. So that's one interesting thing to keep in mind. Anyway, at Tier 3 you have the Nassau, South Carolina, and Kawachi. And probably not a surprise to very many people, you know, the Nassau tends to be the king of just about everything. It leads in battles. Well, it leads in everything. I'm not going to just read them all. It leads in everything. It has the most battles, highest win rate, highest average damage, and highest XP. What's interesting about the average damage value is that the South Carolina, being second in average damage, is 7,319 damage behind the Nassau. Think about that for a moment. 7,319 damage in a Tier 3 fight. That's pretty significant. I mean, that's not just like a, well, you know, that's significant. There's no other way to really put that. You just can't look over that and go, well, yeah, it's close enough. The South Carolina to the Kawachi being in third, only about 2,000 damage. That's a lot more palatable when your average damage across the board is about 20,000 for the Kawachi in South Carolina versus 28,000 for the Nassau. Average XP-wise, they seem pretty consistent across the board. There's only a split of about 40, 50-ish between the top and the bottom. That's not a huge change in XP, so overwhelmingly the average XP is solid. Kill to death ratio, the Nassau is killing on average half a ship extra versus the South Carolina Kawachi, which is pretty close. So, Win rate, Nassau shows a 2.69% win rate over the Kawachi, which actually has a slightly higher win rate over the South Carolina. Anyway, that's Tier 3. Let's go to Tier 4. Of course, Tier 4 is Kaiser, Wyoming, and Myogi. No surprise to anyone here, but the Myogi is awful by some pretty big numbers. I'll be honest, this is probably the least balanced tier for any battleship. Because, wow. So the Kaiser obviously is across the board the king of this. It leads in all of 8 categories. Wyoming coming up in second. The only time it isn't is it survivability is tied with the Wyoming and Myogi are tied in survivability. Kaiser is leading that category by almost 6%. That's a huge change in survivability, but the big shocker here, though, for me was win rate. 3.63% is what the Kaiser leads the Wyoming over. 7,518 damage is what it leads over the Wyoming, and the Wyoming leads over the Myogi by 6,790? Holy cow! That is a huge spread for one tier in terms of damage, average damage done. That's a huge spread. And again, that's the average across all 4 servers. Going on to talk about average XP, there's about 103 XP spread. That's a lot bigger than it probably should be. You really want that to be within about 50 XP. So really, Kaiser, Wyoming, pretty close, but Kaiser, Myogi, holy cow, there's a big difference there. That's definitely a tier in which the Myogi could use some serious buffs, in my opinion, just looking at those primary stats again. Going down to Tier 5, we have Kunik, New York, and Congo. Of course, Kunik leads the way again. We're seeing a repeating theme here, aren't we? So for 3 tiers, the Germans have led the way across the board. The differences here are even more stark, in my opinion. König leads Congo by 11,000 damage on average, and leads the New York by 13,000-ish, 13,600. Again, not very well balanced in terms of average damage output. So what about average XP? Well, New York Congo is pretty comparable. There's only 8 average XP between the two. But New York to König, 129, 130 XP? Really? That's huge. But what's interesting to me is go look at the average plane kills. The anti-aircraft barge that so many people have said, the US, it's their national flavor, is shooting down on average 1 less aircraft per match than the German battleship, than the König. Really? Okay, so apparently that's not a national flavor thing. It's even shooting down less than the Congo is. That's... Anyway, moving on. Tier 6, you have Bayern, Fuso, and New Mexico. And as you can see across the board, Bayern pretty much takes the cake in everything except for win rate. It's tied in survivability with Fuso. Win rate is tied between Fuso and New Mexico. So New Mexico and Fuso tied in win rate. Bayern only 0.2% behind. That's pretty good. Average damage across the board, pretty well balanced. I'd like to see the split between New Mexico and Fuso come down a bit, which is currently at 3,525. That is really quite high in my opinion. I don't think that's a good number, especially since that's about 5,600 to the Bayern. Overall, though, that split's not that bad. The New Mexico could probably use a damage buff. Average XP, looking at about 75 from Bayern to New Mexico. Not a huge difference. It could be a little bit better, but I think if you brought the New Mexico more in line with other ships, it would definitely help in that average XP area. Average plane kills again, New Mexico is still behind the Bayern. And again, like I said before, it was brought to my attention by Vermicelli from Shoot the Red Ships that maybe it's because the Bayern is just being focused by carriers more, and that's why you're seeing it have the opportunity to shoot down aircraft more, whereas U.S. battleships have kind of developed that reputation as being AA barges. I'll let you make your own conclusions. Until I see actual raw numbers, which I doubt Wargaming will ever give us, of the number of aircraft shot down per match, I just don't see how we can do that. So, hoping that averages out over the number of battles, which is a really rather large number of battles for these ships. Tier 7, Colorado, Nagato, and Gneisenau. And once again, it looks like Gneisenau leads the way in everything except for survivability, where she's actually lower on survivability. This is one of the only tiers where the German battleships either aren't tied or in first for survivability, which is interesting given their playstyle, because the playstyle of a German battleship is that in-your-face, big brawler, I'm always the target, look at me thing, but they've got such a favorable armor profile that it makes it very difficult to kill one. Gneisenau, I think, suffers from the issue where she sees Tier 9 fights, and she is so outclassed in a Tier 9 fight that that's what's really driving that number down, especially when she tries to play her primary role as that brawler. She has speed, she has maneuverability, she has those torpedoes, but my word, they just don't make up for that. But let's look at those primary stats. About a 4% difference between Gneisenau and Colorado in win rate. Nagato and Colorado, not a huge difference there in win rate. That's actually pretty acceptable, assuming, of course, you look at the numbers and go, is below 50% an acceptable win rate? What that tells me is that your ship is more of a liability. It's certainly going to depend on player skill there. I don't think that problem comes up in any other tiers below this, where the win rate's below 50. It might come up later, but after that, it seems like Nagato pretty much wins out in everything except for main battery hit rate. Although if you look at the split between Colorado and her, it's only 0.25 percentage point in main battery hits. So apparently they're getting their damage pretty similarly. Speaking of which, there's a 9,000 damage difference between the Colorado and Gneisenau. Only a 3,000 damage difference between Nagato and Colorado, 5,600 for Gneisenau to Nagato, whatever. So that's one area that could definitely use some attention. Average XP difference. Holy cow, 200 average XP difference. 170 of which is made up between Gneisenau and Nagato at 1 and 2. Yikes. I have a feeling that's because the German battleships tend to be more at the front lines. They tend to be pushing. And if you look at the Russian server stats for that, there's a big difference between Gneisenau and Colorado and Nagato for their average XP. Yep. That's probably one area that needs to be addressed. Again, this has been a consistent theme here. Tier 8, North Carolina, Amagi, and Bismarck. Bismarck pretty much leading the way. This is the first tier in which a US battleship actually kills more aircraft than a German battleship. It's also the only tier in which the US leads in battles, if I remember correctly. Nope. Tier 9 has it too, the Iowa. In terms of win rate, 2.76% split between Bismarck and Amagi, and 4% between Bismarck and North Carolina. That's a pretty big win rate jump. If the Bismarck is that far ahead of the other ships, there probably needs to be some tweaking there. 11,000 damage split, 11.5 actually, between Bismarck and North Carolina. Again, that is just a huge number to wrap your head around. In an ideal world, just because these ships play differently doesn't mean they can't do the same average damage. Sure, Bismarck has the added effect of being up close and personal. It means it's got higher main battery hit rate, which is borne out in the stats by about 4%. But by the same token, these other ships should be able to do the same amount of damage even though their playstyle is different. And average XP differences, this split gets even larger than the previous split. This is almost 300. It's 280. 280 XP on average split between Bismarck and North Carolina. Amagi, 235 of that. So Bismarck is that far ahead of Amagi, North Carolina, which really, if you look at the stats, is pretty close to being balanced. There's some tweaks that could be made there, damage being the biggest one, but we're seeing that repeating theme where the German battleships are way up ahead, and I get why. I mean, they're fun to play. Tier 9, Iowa, Zumo, and Friedrich der Grosse. Win rate split is about the same. It's about 4%. And Friedrich is pretty much leading the way in everything except for battles and average plane kills. Go figure. Now, in terms of Iowa-Zumo balance, they're really not too far apart from each other. On average, across the 4 servers, only about 1,400 damage split between the two. There's a literally 5 XP, average XP difference between the two. I mean, that to me seems pretty well balanced, especially given how bad Azuma was. But the stark contrast there is that they're behind Friedrich der Grosse by 7,500 damage and 223 average XP. That's really, again, we're in a point where these ships have way too much influence on the battle. And I really think that's inappropriate to have that level of split between these ships because, honestly, it's a battleship. It should be able to influence the battle a little bit more, and to have that big of a split just tells me that the German battleships are influencing the battle that much more than the US or Japanese battleships are. Now, Azumo is one of the ones that has a lower than 50% win rate. Iowa is above, but just barely. Tier 10, we have Montana, Grosser Kurfürst, and Yamato. Grosser Kurfürst, pretty much across the board, the winner. The only exception being battles, where Yamato actually is much higher in battle numbers. Grosser Kurfürst is dead last, which tells me that not very many people like playing her, especially since they've been out long enough that we should have people there. Montana wins in average plane kills. That's really not that surprising. And it ties the Grosser Kurfürst ties the Yamato in main battery hit rate. Again, owing in large part to the fact that they play at different ranges. The Yamato is the most accurate battleship in the game. It also has the largest caliber guns in the game that break the overmatch mechanic for most ships. Yeah, whatever. Anyway, in terms of second places, though, it's pretty interesting how those splits work out. Grosser Kurfürst and Yamato, only about 2,000 damage between the two. When we're talking about 90,000 damage on average, that's really not a bad number to be at. That's pretty dang close. Montana trails by 6,200 over Yamato and 8,200 over Grosser Kurfürst. That's something that needs to be addressed. And this is where I was talking, the Russian server, if you go and look at the Russian server, 90,000 average damage, 89,000 average damage, 98. Okay, so the Grosser Kurfürst is still about 8,000 above the average for the other ships. But then go look at the other servers. Well, okay, so let's not use North America because we already know the stats for that. It's not good. Europe, 79,599 for the Montana, 89,212 for the Yamato. 10,000 damage difference on one server between those two ships. 79,887 for the Asian server, 83,538. That's closer. That's 4,000 damage. Still a little bit more than it probably should be. Look at the US server. We have the highest average damage with the Yamato. 91,510 versus 79,125 for the Montana. Yikes. That's 12,000 damage difference. So, it's interesting to look at that and go, well, maybe there is a problem there. Average XP is pretty dang good, all things considered, to how they play, but ultimately, there's still more than about 50 XP here, so it tells me that they're playing differently enough. Tier 10 is okay balance-wise. Anyway, at the bottom of this, we have, let me zoom out one tick here so we can see this. At the end of all this, we have the number of trophies, first, seconds, and thirds based on server for battles, etc. If you look at these stats, we'll just use the average across all. It seems like the one that seems to have the most first places is the German line. That's understandable given how popular the line is. That leads in 5 battle numbers. Okay. But what's interesting to me is this number here. When we look at the US Navy and the Japanese Navy, they're pretty consistent across the board with each other in terms of totals. They're pretty balanced to each other, all things considered. There are some things that could probably be tweaked here and there, but at the end of the day, they're both not performing as well as the German line is. That is borne out across all of the servers. On the North American server, the US Navy has some of the worst statistics compared to the other lines. And I can't believe that is only because of playstyle. Could be. I doubt it, but it could be. And Germans are still ahead. Russian server, same story. European server, same story. Asian server, same story. The Germans lead consistently. So anyway, this has been this video for just comparing stats across all of the ships. Like I said, the stats, you have to take them in context with everything. As was pointed out to me, maybe that average plane kills thing has more to do with whether or not that ship is being frequently targeted by aircraft. I have a hard time believing that, looking at the stats for the Tier 8 plus US battleships still being number 1, given that they've been out since halfway through closed beta. I have a hard time believing that people haven't learned that those ships have a lot of AA and cannot be taken down easily with aircraft. So I look at that and I tend to believe those stats, especially from playing the German battleship line. They really do feel like they have really strong anti-aircraft. And they're really not that far behind the US battleships in terms of anti-aircraft kills, even in Tier 8, 9, and 10. So there's not a huge difference there. It's about a half airplane per match. So anyway, I'm your Peacekeeper. This has been another one of my many videos. This one's probably not as interesting as my battle videos, but as with always, guys, like, comment, subscribe, and thank you guys for watching.